chairing today's event. I'm a board member at Future Everything, which is an arts, culture and innovation lab who are producing and curating this event. I got asked to be part of Future Everything, a good few years ago now, maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And it's been the most amazing journey seeing this Manchester organization at the frontiers of technology, working with international governments, businesses all over the world and producing some of the most astonishing and inspiring pieces of art and research. So Future Everything is delighted to be curating the Innovate Manchester programme on behalf of MIDAS and GC Business Growth Hub. The events are actually part of a wider ERDF funded programme designed to facilitate innovative business collaborations across Greater Manchester. So if we can just skip to the next slide. So behind the scenes are the brilliant George and Chris, who you'll probably come across from the Future Everything team. So when I much like Chris Whitty, ask for the next slide, they are going to be driving things in the background. And if inevitably my technical skills outdo me, I will be calling on them for help. But before we start, let me just tell you why we're here. So Innovate Manchester is an ambitious program designed to accelerate our whole city region forward. But it's not just a talking shop. It's a series of cross-sector challenges that are designed to move industries forward and to allow SMEs to collaborate with large businesses and organizations. This is the last of our webinars out of a series of 4. And during the year, we've brought together hundreds of people from academia, the public sector, and the commercial sector. We've had over 350 webinar attendees and workshop participants, and it's actually shaped some serious collaborations between large organizations and the SME community. We're really proud to have produced this program because for over 20 years, Future Everything has been working with SMEs, businesses, and government to create just these kinds of solutions to help shape practical understanding about the future and to create the platform on which the future is built. Our purpose during these workshops, though, and a core objective of the Innovate Manchester programme is to shape solutions that have the potential to be real. So this isn't just about futurology. This isn't just about horizon scanning. This is about creating things that are going to have a real impact in our world today. And with those challenges, they're just problem statements presented by industry, presented by organizations, anything that can provide an opportunity to innovate towards a creative or expert solution. They can be internal, external, operational, strategic, customer-related, supply chain, or anything in between. So how do you get involved in this? Because this is quite important. And what are those next steps? So George, if we can skip forward. Great. So the dates that you see, so the Innovation Lab dates are tailored around the needs of each team. And we'll be doing our very best to make sure that those workshops take into consideration your availability too. So large organizations submit all their challenges by this Friday, the 26th of February. SMEs are then invited to register their interest at the latest by the 11th of March. And then selected SMEs based on that SIFT are to be updated at the very latest by 19th of March. And also today, there'll be a Q&A session around 11:15 where the team will be discussing that process in a bit more detail, going through any questions you may have, and there'll be a Zoom link in the chat for that, which the team will put on there a bit later. But now I'd like to just move on to our incredible program for today. So the topic for today is around human-centered design. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because through the industrial era, we were driven by our technology. We were kind of limited in some ways by our technology. So the solutions that were developed were really oriented around the limited capabilities we had as a species to make things. So the classic example of the ketchup bottle was based on our limitations of how we make bottles at the time, which then became adapted into a more human-centered approach, which is the squeezy bottle we see today. That's just one really uber simple example of an entire ethos. And human-centered design now is allowing us to create technologies and solutions and products and services which have you and me and people at the heart, which should make intuitive sense. And it does make intuitive sense when you hear it from our wonderful speakers today. And the way that we're going to structure our time together is we're going to have a brilliant keynote to start with, before jumping into a series of thought provocations and then into the Q&A. But as I mentioned before, as we go through today, as you've got questions for our panel and for our speakers, please put them in the chat and we'll make sure that we come to those in the Q&A session today. But without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing our keynote speaker. Dr. Caroline Jay is the Head of Research at the School of Engineering and the Digital Futures Human-Centered Design Lead at the University of Manchester. She's our keynote speaker for this morning. We're incredibly proud and privileged to have you with us today. And without further ado, welcome, Caroline. The screen is yours.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Vikas. So I shall just try to share my screen. We do that. And right, can you see my first slide? Okay, excellent.
Yes, you're live. We've got you.
Brilliant. Okay, great. So thank you very much for that introduction. The word ethos, I couldn't have put it better myself, actually. I'm completely on board with that. And what I'm going to do in this talk is try to provide an overview of this really sort of exciting area. It's a difficult topic to tackle in 15 minutes, but I'm going to think about it in quite broad terms. So sort of throwing up some of the topics and ways of thinking and issues that we have around.
Caroline, sorry to interrupt your flow there, but I think we're seeing your speaker notes on screen. So
right,
George, if you can just jump in. Yeah, there we go. That should do it. Okay. Perfect. Apologies for that, Caroline.
No, thank you very much for pointing that out. It's fabulous. Right, okay, but before I talk about the future, I'm just going to remind us of the past a little bit. So this is a fabulous example from The Psychology of Human-Computer Interaction, which is a book by Card et al. That was written about 20 years ago. And it talks about a text editing system. So in this text editing system, typing the word edit while in command mode would cause the system to select everything, delete everything, and then insert the letter T. This last making it impossible to use the system undo command to recover the deleted text, because only the last item could be undone. In an even more spectacular instance, accidentally typing Control-Z would delete all the user's files permanently. So we'll just leave that horror show hanging there for a second. Fortunately, our interaction with technology has moved on, but it's also become much more complicated. So it's a ubiquitous part of us. We take wearable tech, smartwatches, phones, absolutely everywhere. It's embedded in our environments. It's embedded in our homes. We don't expect to have to read a manual anymore to get things to work. So in the example I just gave, obviously it would be normal for people at that stage to sort of read a detailed instruction manual, and it was on the user to make sure that they understood what was supposed to be happening. And this isn't the case anymore. So if something doesn't make intuitive sense, then people are simply going to stop using it, or certainly at the very least get very frustrated. But the situation today is very different. And I go so far as to argue, as I believe you did, Vikas, that we're really getting to the point where we're not being held back by the technology. So there are a number of issues that remain. So resources are obviously an issue, computational efficiency. So, you know, we're working on low power computing, but that's still an issue. So we've still got problems with physics, for example. So we're still going to be constrained by the speed of light. International Zoom calls are going to remain frustrating, I think, for the foreseeable future. But we're also at a stage where when we kind of put these issues to one side, we can do pretty much anything we want. And I mean, for me, this is absolutely epitomized by the jetpack. So during our childhoods, you know, this was really the stuff of comic books, but we can see now that it's being used for mountain rescue in Cumbria. And so we are at the stage really where we don't need to think about, you know, is it possible to design the technology? Because we know that it probably is. And instead, we have to start thinking about what people want from it. You know, people don't want to read instruction manuals anymore. And if something isn't intuitively explainable, then they're just going to give up. So how do we achieve that kind of user experience? So the good news is, actually, we've already got some really straightforward, simple, robust methods that some of us have been using for a long time, certainly been around for a long time, that work really well. So many of you will be familiar with usability evaluation, for example. And this is where you sit down with some of your end users in front of an application, and you ask them to perform some tasks, and you check what they're doing, and you get feedback from them on how well something works. And ideally, you want to take a step back from that. So what we've got here, what we can see here on the screen, is somebody undertaking a paper prototyping exercise. So in this case, we literally use paper and cards to design a user interface before we even start to write the code for that app. So these are really powerful methods that are as relevant now as they ever were, which are a really great way to start getting users involved in the design process very early on. We're also fortunate that there are lots of resources out there. So we can see here just a few of my favourite books, but I think this one in the centre, Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think, remains one of the best web design books, particularly for people who are just starting out with this. And these books are basically built they're written by practitioners and also by academics like me, who spend their time running experiments and developing theory about, how people should interact with computers. But of course, it's not just academics who run experiments these days. So anyone who is able to collect data about their users now has a really wide range of new UX tools at their fingertips. Many e-commerce companies, so Amazon and Google, really good examples of this, are constantly running experiments on their users. So a good example of this is an A/B test, where you basically have one set of users and you give them a slightly different version of the user interface, and you monitor their behavior. And of course, by behavior, we usually mean how much money they spend. And then you check that against another group of users who are using the standard or default interface. And you compare the two to see whether the change that you have made to the user experience has had the effect that you wanted. And the interesting thing about this is that you can start to automate the whole process. So you don't even need to have a person in there designing these tweaks to the user interface. You can actually use machine learning techniques to start to learn what people like and what they don't, and start to automatically manipulate the user interface. And so you can automate the whole pipeline. And in this process of sort of tweaking and testing that you can use continuously is incredibly powerful. So you really have got sort of a lot of potential in terms of starting to use things like artificial intelligence to manipulate the user experience. But of course, whenever we use data, we have to think about ethics. So we can see on the screen here just a few headlines from that have come up in the last year, where we know that artificial intelligence has caused problems primarily because of the way that it's trained. So we can see at the top, for example, that voice recognition, we know it doesn't work as well with women's voices. It doesn't work as well for people with certain accents. So we're discriminating against our users. And of course, this is, results in a poor user experience, but it also means that we are discriminating against people in a way that we probably don't think is acceptable. And then, of course, there's the accompanying reputational damage associated with this as well. So this is a really sort of serious area. So AI has the potential to contribute to user experience and kind of create the user experiences of the future, but we need to be careful about how we use it. Another issue that we have with AI is explaining the decisions that it makes. Many machine learning algorithms are what we call black box. So this means that we can't really understand how they're sort of representing data internally. We don't really understand how they're making decisions. And this is a particular issue with things like neural networks, which underpin deep learning, which of course has proven incredibly effective, but has this issue associated with it. Whenever we're using AI to help us make decisions, we need to understand how it's come up with those. We need to understand the context and background. We need to understand where that decision has come from. So, for example, if you're using an algorithm to help with insurance premiums, we need to make sure that that's not discriminating against people from particular demographic groups. I'd also say, from a UX perspective, that we need to make sure that these algorithms are not only technically explainable, so explainable from a legal perspective, or someone who's kind of an expert in the area would be able to understand what's going on, but also sort of perceptually and intuitively explainable, because otherwise sort of the average person who's using them doesn't really know what's going on. And I think this is particularly important in the area of things like medical decision making. So as we move things out of the clinic onto, into our everyday lives, people are going to be self-monitoring a lot more for health conditions, this kind of thing. And so we want to make sure that we are able to support them in understanding what their monitoring equipment is telling them. And a good example of this that you can see on the screen is Ecg monitoring. So this is something that has typically been done only in hospitals up until recently, and now is available in sort of limited way on things like Apple Watches. So wearables are starting to have an Ecg functionality. And this particular algorithm that you can see here, so you can see 4 ECGs here. So each is a 10-second display. So this is displayed, normally it'd be in a line, but we've got it in polar coordinates because this is better for watches. So you can see each 10-second ECG. And this particular algorithm is monitoring for a relatively common cardiac abnormality that could be caused by a wide variety of medications that can result in some people in sudden cardiac death, which is obviously something we want to avoid. So that algorithm is working underneath, and what you can see is a visualization of how it's working. But without knowing anything about how the algorithm's really functioning, you can see that these 2 ECGs at the bottom, where we can see warmer colors, are at higher risk, showing higher risk than the 2 ECGs at the top, which have cooler colors. So it's this idea of being able to sort of see what the algorithm is doing and being able to sort of visualize how it's working these things out, that enables someone to immediately sort of understand what's going on. And you have this connection with the algorithm, which we call cognitive fit, where you're both the human and the computer are thinking about the data in the same way. We also need to be aware that technology doesn't sit in isolation, but is part of a much bigger system. And we need to understand this system in order to get it to work effectively. So a great example of this is the contact tracing app that many of you will be familiar with. So the interesting thing about this app is that it actually works really well from a technical perspective. So it's been tested exhaustively, and all of these sort of requirements that were specified for it, it actually fits really well. But the difficulty with the app, and I'm sure many people have got stories of how it didn't work for them, is that it's it doesn't just work in isolation, right? It's part of a much more complex sort of socio-technical system. And so this has caused loads of issues. One of the main ones, I think, is related to people's being able to input positive test results. So you are required, if you have a positive test result, you can't just log onto the app and say, yeah, I've had a positive test result. You have to give a code that confirms this. And there's a good reason for this. So we don't want people putting in spurious test results, because that's obviously going to cause issues. So you have to get this code from the test, trace and isolate system, which is a separate system. The two don't talk to each other at all. So you go and you get your test and you get your code, and then you put it into the contact tracing app, and then it tells your contacts. But the problem is, it's been taking a really long time for people to get codes. So you wait for your test, you wait for your test results, you get your code about a week later, often. You put this into the app, and then finally your contacts are notified. And of course, by the time this has happened, probably about 10 days later, they've all been walking around spreading COVID and are quite possibly out of the infectious period by the time they're actually told about this. So that's just one example of how, not really thinking about the rest of the system, or building the app sort of without thinking about that, or without sort of fully embedding it, can cause major issues. So, okay, we want technology to be effortless to use. We want the complex algorithms that underpin our technology to be easy to understand. We want data to work for us, but we want it to work for us in a way that sort of is ethical and fits with the sort of human-centered ethos that we're keen to promote. So it sounds like a pretty tall order, but in fact, I would argue that the way to approach it is relatively simple. We need to think about this from the perspective of designing with humans in mind, with society in mind, rather than technology. So it's about shifting sort of away from thinking, what tech can we build, and rather thinking, what do people need, and how can we use technology to support that? So as we move towards the future, an effective user interface design becomes ever more important. The good news is, I think, that the process and the steps you can take towards that are relatively straightforward. And the most important one to start with is simply sitting back, thinking about your creative process and your design processes, and moving the focus away from technology and switching it towards people. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Caroline, for that. That was brilliant. And it's interesting because as you're talking, it also reminds me of the fact that we're at a stage with development now where in certain spaces, such as social media, we've actually been able to optimize our platforms so much against what we want as human beings, that they're actually now starting to be able to manipulate us in unexpected ways and create different types of much more negative loops for society as well. So we need to be acutely aware of that too. But no, thank you so much. And I'm sure that our attendees today will have lots of questions for you in the Q&A, which is coming up. So make sure you pop your questions in the bottom as well, and keep on the Menti as the team are reminding you. So coming up next today, we have a series of thought provocations. And so these are some of our guests who are joining us just to talk about their insight on this topic today. And I'm sure you're going to love hearing from them as well. So first up today is friend of Future Everything, Vimla Appadu, who is the head of experience at Culture Shift. So Vimla, the screen is yours.
Thank you. Great, so everyone should be able to see my screen now. So as Vikas mentioned, I'm the head of experience at Culture Shift, an organisation that specialises in building software for people who have experienced bullying or harassment to report it and get the support that they need. And I'm also the co-founder of an organisation called HoneyBadger, which specialises in designing positive workplace cultures. So I want to talk today about where I think we are in the world of technology, but also in implementing human-centered design. And Dr. Caroline J actually mentioned this in her talk around the ethics and the problems that we have in the way that we're implementing human-centered design at the moment, and some of the negative consequences that we're starting to see. And it looks a lot like this. People who are applying for jobs are being filtered out by on the basis of their name. So without realizing it, the technology that we're putting out into the world is negatively discriminating people from different ethnic origins, which has a massive consequence on life outcomes, job offerings, but also just the way that we experience the workplace. And it gets even more stark when we start to think about the application of this technology in the technology that we're hoping to see in the future. Self-driving cars aren't that far away, but the tech that's gone into them disproportionately will hit Black people more than they would white. And what this shows us is what's missing from the design process in being able to include all types of people from different backgrounds, different cultures, different perspectives in that process to influence and change the way that that technology is implemented and used in real life. And the bias gets worse when we start to think about how life-changing decisions are starting to be made on that same technology. And what always strikes me is this has been happening for the last 20 years. This isn't new. And we continuously putting this out into the world because we think it's good enough. We think it's better to move quickly and break things than to actually do the design process, do the testing, bring in those unheard voices, and make sure that no one is being excluded. We've become to a point where we want things quickly and we want it now. And that's at the risk of people who are often disenfranchised, who are often left out of the system, and whose voices are often unheard. And so when we look at how we're using facial recognition technology to do stop and search in London in particular, it was found that the technology that was being used would stop and search Black and ethnic minority people more than it would their white counterparts. And as we've heard already, the history and the information that's feeding the algorithms is often steeped in bias or historical prejudice, which then proliferates the way that it's rolled out in society. And time again, particularly in the public sector, this technology is rolled out knowing that this is going to happen and that this is, the negative consequence. But we're willing to put up with that because it means the technology is rolled out. And what we're starting to see is that procurement cycles, contracts, deadlines, and having to get things out because the budget says we have to, is what's making the decisions happen, rather than the ethics or the understanding of who might be affected by it. And the voices of the people who are being discriminated against aren't considered in that process at all, or it happens too late. So it will happen when it hits the news headline, or when the meme comes out about someone failing to get their passport because the technology wouldn't recognise their photo. But by that point, it's already out in the world and it's already doing harm. So what can we do to try and stop that from happening? And it gets even more stark when we start to see the image recognition technology as well. So this is a screenshot from Google's image recognition technology that places two different skin tones holding the same image and the way that the technology reads that image. And we often celebrate the fact that we can do this, that we have the technology that is able to really make a difference or that can be applied, than we are about understanding the negative consequences. And it is time that we slow down and really think about how we bring that human element back into the design process, into the dev process, and take into consideration who it is that's being excluded. Because we need to get to a point where actually all of those disenfranchised voices, all of the people who have been excluded, have a voice in shaping the future of technology, so that we can bring more equality and equity into the way that we access services and products that we're all delivering and putting out into the world. So we want to create a world where we include more voices into our organisations so that the products we design, deliver, and build work for everyone. so that we're not putting anything out into the world that excludes people, that might work for the majority but excludes the few, or actually doesn't work for the majority at all, but just works for a small user base that it's been tested with. Because we need to be bringing into the conversation different ages, different backgrounds, different cultures, different abilities, everything that makes us diverse and different, so that we have a true representation of people through the testing process, so that when we go out into the world, when we put those services and products out there, we know that there's going to be a higher chance of it being successful for the majority, and the problems we have to fix become smaller. And as we've mentioned already in this conversation, it will mean that we have a lower risk. The more effort we put into this in the design process, the lower the risk, the less cost in the long term, because you don't have that media fallout. And also, it's just a better experience for everyone across the board. No one wants to be the organisation that forgot to test with accessibility or with people of colour. Because it's now time to move beyond good enough. We had a huge technological revolution in the last decade. We're at a point where everyone the majority of people carry mini computers in their pockets. We're reliant on technology more now than we ever have before. So it's time to slow down. It's time to move beyond good enough and get to a point where we actually consider everyone in the design process and make sure no one is excluded, so that we can design a future and put technology out into the world that works for everyone. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Vimla. And coming up next with our thought provocations is Philippa Nazari, who's the Assistant Director of Information Governance and Data Protection Officer at Greater Manchester Combined Authority. So Philippa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vikas. Well, as I just share my screen, I would just like to say I am not obviously a human-centered design practitioner. However, I do feel today that I'm in amongst my tribe. It feels very much like where I should be, and where what I'm going to talk to you about really fits very well. So obviously I'm a data protection officer, so I ensure the organisations that I work for, Greater Manchester Combined Authority and Transport for Greater Manchester, are doing the right things and legal things with people's personal data in terms of what they are, the services that they're delivering, the technology that they are developing and deploying across Greater Manchester. It's really interesting to hear Dr. Caroline J talk about whole system and how technology fits into that whole system, because what I do by nature and what my team does is works with the organisation to understand that whole picture around what they're doing with individuals' information. So, we simply can't get to the point of the technology where we're developing the technology and think that that's an okay place to start. So it's great to hear Dr. Caroline J to say we need to shift our thinking from the technology to what do people need, and very much putting people at the heart of everything that we do. Fundamentally, data protection, let's get my slide to move. Data protection is a human right. The right to privacy, the right to not have interference in your life, in your home life, is actually a human right. So it's putting that human element right back into the considerations that we need to be thinking about, and the impacts that what we are doing have on human beings. What do humans need? How do we ensure that what we're doing doesn't proliferate the issues that Vimla has just spoken about? How do we make sure that the way in which we are developing technology doesn't discriminate against individuals? So it very much comes back to, and if you're thinking about people from the beginning and thinking about privacy by design and using individuals' data in a way that doesn't cause them harmful impacts, because lawfully you shouldn't be doing that, ethically absolutely shouldn't be doing that. There is no right way to do the wrong thing. And so I very much have to take organizations and take projects on a journey of thinking, well, let's roll it right back. Let's think about the issue that we're trying to address. Let's think about how we can incorporate the human element right up from the beginning. So let's think about the individuals that are going to be using the technology, or that the technology will provide an outcome for, or a decision for, because these are people's lives. And obviously, I'm very much anchored in the public sector, where I work currently. So it's even more important. Well, it's just as important, but perceptually, it's even more important that we're doing the right things for individuals, and that they say, you know, that we don't cause any harm to individuals as well. So thinking about data protection, ethics, and what people actually need, and bringing that right into the very beginning of not the technological process and the development process, but I have to take it even further back to policy decisions. So, you know, is this the right set of thinking? Is technology the answer in this situation? And you know, what impacts is that going to have on the individuals that we're working with? So obviously, you know, that's anchored in the Data Protection Act 2018. We also have UK GDPR, which I'm sure everyone will be aware of now that we've left the EU. And we're very much seeing now the focus around ethics, around making sure that we don't discriminate, and you know, that we don't drive inequalities that COVID has shone the light on, that we're very much now aware of, and other key agendas as well. So, in terms of, oh, bear with me a second, I've got something going on here. Do bear with me a sec. So we are at a crossroads around thinking about how we make sure that we build into our design processes the thinking at a very, very early stage around how we don't further discriminate against people, around how we can put people right at the heart of what we're doing and what we're thinking, and what are the tools that enable us to do that. So, you know, there are actually digital tools being developed and have been developed that help us with that thinking, help us incorporate that you know, assessing those impacts right at the beginning of what we're trying to achieve for individuals. And you know, there has to be an awareness. There has to be the kind of the very much the awareness of what we're trying to do for those individuals. So for example, you know, we want to start looking at how we would perhaps use algorithms to look at cohorts of children who would perhaps not be starting school ready to learn. That initial conversation happened with me with a group of analysts who said, we could do this. We could use technology to do this, we could build the algorithm. And I said, that's great, but have you spoken to the practitioners who work with the families? Because how's that going to impact on how they deliver services? Have we talked to individuals who have been through, you know, had children supported through the services currently being delivered? How do they feel about those now? How would they feel about that process being changed and enabled by, you know, a kind of an earlier conversation where you've looked at a number of indicators around this individual, you know, whilst they're pregnant, and their family setup and understanding those things, and saying, oh, actually, you know, based on a number of indicators that, you know, the computers told us that your child's going to start, you know, may start school not ready to learn, so therefore we want to put some interventions in. That's a difficult conversation to have, and perhaps a difficult concept for the public to understand. So, you know, it's understanding really how and making sure that, you know, that thinking and those conversations happen before we get to developing the algorithm and developing the technology, that we understand the concerns and pitfalls and things that may go wrong by actually engaging with people at the other end of the process, and those individuals actually, and practitioners and professionals actually delivering those services. You know, because then you're talking to the right people, and you're not at risk of kind of embedding, you know, the harms really, and we're very much thinking about, you know, what could be the impacts, the harmful impacts around developing these types of technologies and making these types of decisions. The other thing to note, to mention is around, and very much talks, you know, harks back to data protection, is that data quality, you know, is a huge but dampener, I think, dampener of being able to use technology in a way that is and data in a way that doesn't provide harmful outcomes. So Dr. Caroline J talked about, you know, the use of these types of technologies and algorithms in medicine and healthcare. You know, that could end up being a life and death situation if that data isn't correct. And so there's very much a thing to think about around, you know, where's the data coming from, who's providing that information, how that's feeding into the technology that is providing those outcomes, and how we develop that. And that goes again back to humans and individuals and people that are inputting that information in systems, how we collect that data, but also how can it be improved by including individuals in that process whose you know, the medical decisions will be made about them. There's a GP in Greater Manchester actually who's a massive advocate for accessing information and patients accessing their own information. There's apps to do that, but actually without the understanding element, you know, looking at your test results and going, okay, there's my test results, but what does that actually mean for me and my condition, or, you know, do I have a new condition? And so that's why the conversation with the GP who has the knowledge and the training and the professionalism is so important. So again, it's going back to where the technology fits within the system, how it works. And so very quickly, because I know I've probably gone over time because I could talk about this forever, I always use RuPaul because generally when I'm talking about information sharing and sharing information more broadly across a technological system or integrated systems, you know, if you don't take care of your data and your data collection and understanding and the humans input into that and the individuals, if you don't take care of that and then you share it more broadly, you're proliferating issues and inaccuracies that can cause harm right across the technological system. So RuPaul always says, you know, if you don't love yourself, how the hell are you going to love somebody else? And it's exactly the same thing, I think, with kind of human-centered design and understanding data and where that's coming. So final thought for me is, whilst there's huge opportunities for digital innovations and the technology, as Dr. Caroline J said, we could do anything with it. It's really, again, reiterating that message of technology. Is it the right thing to do? Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Philippa. And I've got to say, any presentation that features RuPaul is an instant winner. So thanks for the insightful presentation there. So next up today, the final thought provocation for our morning together is Alex Nelson, who's the UX principal with BBC R&D Future Experiences. So Alex, welcome, and the screen is yours.
Thank you, and hello everybody. So for those of you that don't know BBC R&D, we've been around for about 100 years, and you might know us from inventions such as fax, which to me felt like the internet before that was a thing, colour TV, and lots of kind of broadcast technology. But now we're much more likely to be looking at areas such as capturing 3D artifacts, or looking at kind of multimodal storytelling across different devices. And we spend a lot of our time in the team that I'm in thinking about these future experiences and these future human experiences, from looking at what if we could bring people together through synchronized experiences. So this is called Pick Apart, where it's a musical experience where different people can connect to it with their devices, and each person's device plays a different part of the musical score. We've also got more kind of dramatic uses of this technology. We're really interested in personal data And we've been doing lots of exploration about how we can give people better control over their personal data. This is BBC Box, a physical prototype of a personal data store, but we're currently working with Tim Berners-Lee's Solid Foundation to look at kind of web-based versions of that, and looking at what a connected data ecosystem might be if it's really focused on the user. Yeah, we're also interested in immersive technologies. So we've been spending time with different cultural organizations and looking at how together we can capture and curate the world's most important historical artifacts and put them into an augmented reality app. But all of these technologies, although kind of fascinating by themselves, unless they are really designed with humans and with the things that we value, there's kind of no point in exploring them. You know, we kind of have a bit of a US kind of West Coast way of measuring performance of digital services around time spent, but time spent doesn't necessarily mean time well spent. So we've been doing some research looking at how we can measure this interesting space between observable behavior, so those kind of actions that people are doing that is very easy to kind of watch and track, and kind of fundamental needs that everybody has, which are quite difficult for people to describe and not always entirely explicit. And we've identified this area in the middle that is that we call values, which are the things that people can talk about, which represent those motivational needs, but actually result in these observable behaviors. And from that research, we've developed what we call the Human Values Framework, which is a set of design tools, but also a set of metrics that we can use to make sure that A, we're designing experiences that have people's values at the heart of them, and B, we are able to measure how the experiences that we create affect those values. And we've distilled them down into these 14 priority values. And yeah, we have a whole set of guidelines for how to use this that's available for anybody to use in or outside the BBC. So yeah, would encourage you to check those out. So that was a very quick overview, but really what I want to do is leave people with a bit of a provocation and get you to think about how well the digital services you use, or if you're a creator of digital services, how well they serve human values. And over on Menti, I think George is going to be setting up a question that allows you to just think about the digital services you're using or creating at the moment, and think about how you would rate how they affect your personal human values. So yeah, I think hopefully that was a very quick overview. We're a little bit behind schedule, but should be back on time now. Yeah, I'll be around to answer some more questions a little bit later on. And yeah, if there's anything that you've seen here that you'd like to ask more about, do feel free to drop me a line. The BBC R&D website has background info on a lot of the projects that I've talked about. And we're currently working with Nesta on developing a website specifically around human values. And yeah, you can get into those by going to humanvalues.io. So yeah, very quick overview from our view of the world. I think it's back to Vikas now.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex. That was really fascinating. So next up today, we've got our panel Q&A, but just before we get to that, I'd like to just get George to bring in our word cloud. So the first question that we'd asked everyone is, what's the first word that comes to mind when you think about human-centered design? And it's just really wonderful to see that really human word of empathy coming through in the middle, because that's so important when we're designing. Because if we don't have empathy with human experience and with the value set for our customers and users, then the product's simply not going to work. And we do have a couple more questions for you on there as well. And one of the most important questions actually for current days was, how do you feel about going back to the office? And as we would expect, actually, you know, the largest response there was to go back on a flexible basis, because I think the pandemic has really just opened the floodgates of people being able to work from home, but it's also highlighted that need for human connection as well. So a lot of people do want to get back to their office, even on a temporary basis, to actually be able to interact with their colleagues and more. But from here, I'd like to jump into our Q&A. Oh, so there was one more, my apologies. So the next one up was, how well does technology help you in these areas? And exploring the world and expression, strongly agree. And actually, again, this is something which social media has done extremely well. It's meant that we as individuals have that platform for expression and that platform for research and exploration, which we simply never had before. So at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Q&A tab. So as we jump into the Q&A, I'd love for all of our audience to ask your questions on there, and we'll pick them as we go along. But, you know, this is such a big area and such a fascinating area that intersects with technology, human experience, design, psychology, and all of the things about what makes us intrinsically human. And it changes rapidly. You know, even our risk profile as human beings has changed in the pandemic, meaning that what constitutes good design, even in supermarkets now, is very different because it has to be oriented around social distancing and hygiene in different ways than ever before. But I want to start with a question for all the panel. So it would be great to maybe just get a little reflection from each of you. And so, you know, over the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see technology continuing to grow, and we're going to continue to see areas of our lives which are ripe for this kind of disruption from a human-centered design approach. So for just one reflection, perhaps from each of you, is what are the areas that you think that we interact with on a daily basis, which could have the biggest changes coming from a more human-centered design approach? So whoever wants to take that first, feel free to jump in.
So just a quick one from me. I think media. I won't say too much because I'm sure Alex can comment on this more. But I think media is a really big one. So I think that sort of VR, personalization, you know, using kind of more of the environment that you're in for media experiences, I think is going to be one area where hopefully there's going to be a lot of progress.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of see, obviously media, something we're very focused on, but really I think the shift from linear media to more participatory and personalized services is really interesting. I think particularly when you look at the advances in game design and video game technology, there's lots to take from there. I think that, you know, we kind of quite often in the BBC think about, you know, media or games, and this space in the middle is a little bit uncomfortable for some, but I think that that's definitely worth exploring. And I think, immersive technologies and, you know, augmented reality, if that does become mainstream, if we're walking around with kind of headsets and glasses, what does social media look like in that world where we're not just presented with scrolling feeds, which, I hope that we can really break away from. There's lots of talk of the metaverse, so a kind of shared virtual space that everybody's connected to, that hopefully will interact seamlessly with our physical space. I think that feels like a really good place to research, and you know, there are risks there as well, and to make sure that we don't create experiences that exclude people as we dive into these new technologies.
Yeah, I think actually one of the spaces where I think there's a huge potential to improve the human experience is around quantified self, and the way that we have access now to more data about ourselves than ever before. So through smartwatches, our smartphones itself, all the devices that track us and everything we do. And I think there's a really big opportunity to think about the experience of accessing that data, to understand ourselves more, but also to give ourselves a sense of ownership of how we control and share and really have ownership of all of that, but also the opportunity for using it to help us make decisions about our lives. And we talked a little bit about health, but all of those health aspects of how many steps you do, what your ECG might be, how we kind of use services like 23andMe to understand our ancestry, like all of that stuff, and putting it into a single place where we own it and understand it rather than the organizations.
Thank you. I have to agree with you, Vim, on that point, and coming from the basis that I do, there's great opportunity, a massive opportunity to empower people through the use of their data and providing them access to, but also that understanding so that they can make those decisions. So very much investing in how we can raise awareness and educate people about what that data and information collected about them does actually mean for them. So some transparency around that would be great. There's another thing that that's coming up around how we interact with our environments and climate change, and actually how that technology can enhance our ability to manage our impact on the environment as well.
Right. And actually, it might be a good one to come to first. So I want to make sure we take our audience questions sort of first and foremost before the ones from the team as well. And John Wally asks on the environmental front, I believe that human-centered design can play a huge role in helping address the environmental crisis. Does the panel agree? So, feel free to whoever wants to take that first. And I think that's such an important question for right now.
I could maybe talk about that a little bit. So we've been doing a bit of experimentation in this area. Again, looking at personal data, and I think there's a lot of data that people are presented with around the environment, which is quite confusing. And just seeing big lists of stats on statistics on a web page, that doesn't really mean a lot to people. And I think the more we can contextualize that data, so we make it more personal to them in terms of where they are, but also them in terms of their own habits and their own consumption. I think we can design human-centered experiences that really help people better understand that. For example, visualizing through your plastic use or your kind of transport use, actually using perhaps augmented reality to show what the true impact of that is on your immediate environment. So kind of using it for data visualization, I think, is a really good way of just helping people better understand the impact of their actions.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think actually the narrative around climate change in the past has faltered when it's come to that data and storytelling, because the statistics are really overwhelming and not easily digestible. And I think if we take a human-centered design approach to that storytelling, we can have a much bigger impact in what those numbers mean and the impact that it has for today. And I don't always think it needs to be as dystopian as the storytelling has been so far. I think there are ways that we can build that narrative into something that's easy to understand and makes us, again, feel empowered to do something about it.
Caroline, on this one as well, obviously, you're part of the School of Engineering. And do you think that this is also where, material science and manufacturing is also going to play a role in this climate challenge when we consider human-centered design?
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think on the manufacturing side, we've got, in terms of technology development, so one of the things that's really positive is we're looking a lot more at sort of low energy and so on. So on the environmental side, we're kind of going to move more to sort of battery focused, I think, certainly in terms of vehicles, in terms of transportation generally. I think in terms of user experience as well, there are going to be lots more options in the future. So smart manufacturing means that it's going to be easier for us to change the manufacturing process. So up till now, it's been, production lines been something that's quite difficult to slow down or difficult to change rapidly. And we're certainly moving towards sort of more data-driven engineering. So being able to sort of think about, so as we move towards Industry 5, and we're thinking about taking data from people and using sort of the sort of human-centric methods in our manufacturing processes, that's great. And just one final thing, I think, from that I think is going to be in the future much more important. We're not quite sure how it's going to turn out yet, but is 3D printing, right? So this is going to be something where in the future people are going to be able to do this themselves at home. And that completely changes things potentially in terms of how we think about manufacturing products, how we think about sort of what we use. And so I think that that's one for the future, right? But I think there are lots of interesting opportunities there in terms of both minimizing waste, but also developing products that I think really fit within our lives.
Yeah. It's a fascinating area, and actually the two challenges for today, which we'll see in around 11:15 for those individuals who want to stay on to participate, is the NHS Care Alliance have actually put two challenges forward, one around air quality and one around carbon emissions. So if you are an SME looking to participate, do stay on for that. The next question today, which is from Emma Ainsworth, which is a very practical question, she asks, as someone trying to influence a large, somewhat archaic business, I find it really difficult to influence them to recognize the importance of user experience design in their future technologies. Do you have any tips or examples that I might be able to share with them to highlight the practical benefits? I think this is, again, a really important point around advocacy for this approach. So whoever wants to kick off with that one, feel free.
Sorry if I jump in there, just because it's something that I get asked a lot, but also have a lot of experience in trying to convince big organisations that this is the right approach. And fundamentally, what it's always come down to for me is building the business case around it. So breaking it down into the really tangible financial returns of better experiences equals better innovation and better return on investment. And that's a skill in itself, to develop and understand how to really justify those costs and cost savings really in the long term. But it's because it's the long term, it becomes a difficult conversation to have. But it's really important that we start to understand that this isn't just a nice thing to do or the right thing to do. It's actually the most cost effective thing to do. And then the second part of that is finding the advocates within an organisation that get it, the early adopters, and bringing them on board to shout alongside you and kind of find a team of people that can be with you to have those conversations and just keep doing it, because it's the only thing that starts to change. And as soon as people start to see the fruits of labour, the impact and the success stories, it becomes a really easy conversation to have.
If I could come in now, I completely agree with everything that Vim's just said. Actually, go and find your advocates who may not be the individuals that think they are, that you would think. So, people like me, data protection, information governance, people who are, as their bread and butter, putting people and humans at the heart of what they do, very much has alignment and cut across and can actually strengthen that business case as well, because you'll be addressing, some of the reputational damage that can come about by not using this approach, and and it is a long-term thing. Everything that I do actually is around change and is a long-term, and they are the more difficult conversations to have, especially in businesses where you're there to make money essentially, but it's just as hard in the public sector, because it's not the tangible, I can put my hands on right now kind of situation, but it is the most beneficial and the absolute necessary thing that we need to do going forward.
Alex, I think just on this point as well, the BBC in particular have had a massive cultural transformation vis-a-vis their relationship with technology, and actually the level of innovation that's happening there. I think it might be interesting just to get your views on Emma's question as well. But looking at more, what do you think it was that really shifted the needle at the BBC on this? Because that's an organization which historically would have fallen into that category of perhaps not being seen as innovative, but now it's front and center of what's happening around human-centered design.
Yeah, and it's kind of challenging, and there isn't really a single approach with this. I might talk about one that's maybe a slightly more stealthy approach, in that a lot of kind of user-centered design practices are really helping you make good decisions as a group of people. And actually, if you take that practice and if you become the kind of facilitators within your organization, you're actually then able to get in front of people that maybe, there is a bit of a barrier there. And you can actually, using things like the Design Council's Double Diamond or design sprints, you can actually help use human-centered design practices to help the organization make decisions, and you kind of start to sneak UX in there without them really realizing that it's happening to them. And another way that, one of the big things that we do within R&D is not think about how we immediately influence the organization, but actually think about how we influence the industry first. So, we might have a particular technology like object-based media where before we kind of influence the organization to start making these experiences, we might first have to influence camera manufacturers in terms of the standards that they have, that they kind of capture the media with. So thinking about whether you can influence the organization by influencing the industry first, and then kind of having that kind of greater weight of opinions to then go back and influence the organization. But yeah, there kind of isn't really a magic bullet with this. I think it's try lots of different things, and make sure you're having conversations with the right people.
Brilliant. I'd love to come to our next question now, which is from Matt Hart. Now, Matt's answered two questions. So I'm going to ask two, but I'm going to take the liberty of taking one which links to a point that Vimla was talking about. So Matt's question. So Matt says, I create products in an industry where the customer base is 60 to 70% white male, and it's tabletop and role-playing games. But excitingly, there's growth across more diverse segments. How is it possible to design for new users without accusation of cultural appropriation or virtue signaling or a lack of authenticity? For example, it might be that it is a bunch of white dudes designing for black female role players, as an example. And I think that's a fascinating sort of potential dilemma, and certainly a fascinating question. So please, feel free, whoever wants to pick that up to start with.
Sorry, you go.
Okay, so I think the one thing that I think is really important there is just getting authentic voices in storytelling. So you can, we've commissioned content before, and it's aimed at teenagers, but it's written by middle-aged white guys, and it really shows, it is just immediately obvious, and you kind of lack any authenticity. So I think there are so many creators out there that are people of color, or represent the minority groups that you might want to be reaching out to. So I would just make sure that you're including them in your process right from the start, because you more than likely have biases that you don't realize are there. And I think you just need that authentic voice to really check those and just help you create those authentic stories.
Yeah, great. And I think Caroline and Vimla both wanted to come in. I'm not sure who was first.
But I'll be very quick. I totally agree with that. I also would say, as well as including voices within tech, there are major. It's not always a welcoming place to people who don't fit the normal stereotype. So actually thinking about employing, across a company, trying to reach out and employ people who maybe don't fit the normal white guy demographic is something that I think is really valuable as well, because those people are out there, but they fall out of the pipeline. And actually, I think sort of focusing on that as well in terms of technology development is a really good thing to do.
Yeah, I agree with both of those points. I think it's about making sure the teams that are designing and developing that work or that content are as diverse as possible. Because equally, we wouldn't want a team of white guys developing a storyline for an audience of white guys, because you're then just perpetuating those same biases within the audience. So that diversity is as crucial for an audience that looks and thinks the same as it is for an audience that is diverse. So we want to bring that diversity in no matter what the content is anyway.
And Philippa, from your perspective as well, obviously, you're working on local government, and that involves designing services for extraordinarily diverse groups. How within your work, how do you address this? Because it's often, inevitable and unavoidable that the group designing services for particular citizens will not naturally be made up of groups of those citizens themselves.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case, Vikas. And I suppose it's people like mine's role to challenge that, and through the privacy by design process, actually ask those questions. How are you addressing that? How are you, you know, when you're collecting data about these individuals, you know, how are you addressing that? And actually, similarly to what Caroline has said around, you know, a diverse workforce, so we're seeing a massive drive across local government now in how we can actually, you know, create more diverse workforces and how we can actually engage with the public, and very much around, like I said, around the school readiness kind of example. We need to go and speak to those individuals who we're designing services for. So we might not have the people within our own teams, but we are making sure that you know, we are going and speaking to the people who are going to be effective. And I know in Greater Manchester they've set up now the Equalities Commission, and there's huge drives, and we're just making sure that the things that are coming out of those pieces of work are actually filtering through to the projects and programs and service design and service delivery that, you know, that we're delivering on the ground. And it's really key that those connections are made right through. Right through the threads pulled right through.
Yeah, and I think it's also sometimes, especially with questions around ethics, we've got to kind of caution ourselves as individuals that we don't make attribution errors. So the race in AI situation is one where we can fall foul of this quite often, because the same algorithm that Vimla was mentioning, that where you had the hand holding a temperature gun or whatever the device was, and it was attributed in one sense as being a gun and the other sense as being a monocle, that the exact same algorithm actually managed to attribute turtles as being firearms. So sometimes what we have to be extremely careful of is, oftentimes we can assert that it's our human bias, for example, race, that's creating a result, where in fact it's not. It's either a result of bad programming, bad data sets, or indeed it's a fault in the system of how the algorithm was created. So we have to make sure that in some ways we distance our humanity from the system to make sure that what we're seeing is a real reflection of that output. A question from Gary Lovett, which also relates to this kind of ethical side of a dilemma with this. So Gary says, in terms of understanding self, if it was a well-being app and people were being fed back their consistently low well-being scores, is there a potential that this could be more harmful? Because we know that there's an ability to intervene in such situations, but where there's a boundary between respecting privacy and safeguarding the genuine threats of individuals coming to harm, how do we cross that boundary? And I think we've seen this a little bit with the NHS pandemic app in terms of protecting the public. But I think when we start to get much deeper into health, this does become an issue. So Gary, if I may, I think I'd love to extend this question a little bit and ask our panel, you know, human-centered design is actually now going to be able to intervene in our lives a lot more, whether it's in health or otherwise. You know, how do we actually manage that balance between giving us the right information and preventing harm?
So if I just pick up on that briefly, I think the way that I would look at it is about choice as well. So obviously we've got all these sort of tensions between privacy, between sort of choice, between kind of potentially intervening in a successful situation. So a sort of health example, where we've talked about this a lot within the university is around environmental health and air pollution. And so there are lots of projects at the moment that go on where we're sort of monitoring sort of pollution within Manchester, health of people living in certain areas. And the difficulty is, where you've got a polluted area, it's great to have the data about how polluted it is, and we collect that. But actually, like, do we want to, you know, how do we share that with the residents of that particular area? You know, because they can't do anything about it. So we need the data so that, you know, we can take action elsewhere. But it's really hard, and it's absolutely the case that we need to think really carefully about how we make information available and what people want to do with it. So I think it's I think it's a constant tension, and I don't think we have the answers to that at the moment, but it's just having that dialogue with people and sort of understanding where the balance should sit, really.
Alex, I think, sorry, Philippa, you go ahead.
Thanks. I was just going to say, I support what Caroline says, and it goes back to looking at that whole system kind of element of it. Where does that fit into the broader system? So is the information that we're providing through that wellbeing app actually connected to the GP record? When is that intervention? Does the individual understand that it's part of that and very much around choice? We don't want to get into this kind of big brother is watching you and everything that you do. And there's a great video that was created by a policy group years and years ago, which I call Dystopian Pizza, where basically somebody rings up for a pizza and he ends up with a salad because they've looked at his health records, his health insurance records, where he lives, how much he's on, the car he drives, etc., and all those indicators. And in the end, even to the point of looking at where he searched for his last holiday. So he went on a budget website rather than a luxury website, and so therefore he couldn't afford the pizza that he wanted to go for, and so he ends up with a salad and a water or something. That type of intervention is horrifying. We should never, I don't think, get to a position where somebody has got that element of control when you're and that element, that level of data about you. However, there are circumstances in which you can deploy that level of understanding to an individual to really, to their benefit, if they want it, and that is getting that balance right.
Yeah, and I'd love. Oh yeah, I was going to say I'd love to come to you, Vimla and Alex, on this as well. But Alex, before you respond, I've got a specific question on this for you. But Vimla, if you go ahead first.
I completely agree with what Dr. Caroline and Philippa have said there. And I think when we think of intervention, our mind immediately goes into a doctor's phone call or like the really hard interventions. But actually what we can start thinking about is the reverse, and using nudge theory as part of those interventions. So small, tiny bits of intervention that can change our behavior over time. And again, social media does this really well, but actually if we apply it to well-being or health or different applications, it can have a really positive impact. So that intervention doesn't have to be huge. It could be something really small that helps people understand their well-informed behavior. But again, that doesn't overcome that problem of like overbearing bad news constantly, if it's something that's not nice. So I think that's where human-centered design needs to be there, to understand how to handle and manage that.
And Alex, on the media front, and I think the BBC have been very good at this. So I'm not going to be picking at the BBC, but I think a lot of media organizations, sometimes there is that ethical consideration, which is, to what extent does the volume of bad news impact psychology? To what extent are news headlines designed to be sticky and draw people in and actually end up manipulating the public? When the business model of the industry suddenly becomes about optimizing the human-centered design to the point where it starts to manipulate us, how do you find that balance? How can we create a healthier relationship, for example, in the media, between the commercial realities of running media organizations and what is beneficial for society?
Yeah, I think what you start to get into, I think particularly as you introduce new technologies into the mix with that, is you really start to look at consequence scanning. So looking at the deliberate but also the unintended consequences of the systems, the new systems and services that you're creating. And I would definitely ask people to point people towards .everyone, who have some really good consequence scanning tools, as well as Artifact Group have a great set of tools called the tarot cards of technology, which look at things like if you create a service that is a runaway success, that's a good thing, right? But actually, what if somebody becomes obsessed with that service, and what is the negative consequence of that repeated use? So it's something that we constantly battle with, and you start to get into to really tricky things like filter bubbles with personalization, and we definitely haven't solved those areas. But I think just in the first instance, understand what those consequences are. And then second, recognize if are you actually inadvertently creating an intervention with people. If you are, bring on medical experts, bring on psychiatrists, bring them into the team to make sure that you're doing it in the right way.
Yeah, it's actually really fascinating, because sometimes this again plays into our own human security. So just to give you one example, IBM Watson Health, their machine learning based algorithm was able to diagnose lung cancer significantly more accurately than a human was, based on the data that was input from x-rays in that situation. And the medical community in that case felt uncomfortable about an AI that was able to make diagnoses much faster and much more accurately. So IBM quite smartly switched this from being a diagnostic to an augment to the diagnosis, where instead of the computer saying there's some lung cancer kind of here, it said, doctor, you might want to just have a look at this. I don't know what it is. So it's humanizing the way that the technology interfaces with the doctor, so they don't feel less human as a result. So I think this is a very fascinating area. Now, I'm kind of conscious of time as well. So what I'd love to do is kind of ask a roundup question to all of the panel before we then wrap up the event and go into the session with the SMEs that wish to stay on. And so, we've talked a little bit about the kind of dystopian aspect. We've talked a bit about this kind of overreach, but I want to end on a positive note. And for each of you, what is the area of human-centered design that really excites you for the future? Where do you think we're going to see the biggest positive transformation that these kind of design approaches will have in our lives? So whoever wants to tackle that big question first, please jump in. Go ahead, Caroline.
Yeah, go on. I'll have a go. So I think I'm going to give a personal view, because this is what I'm interested in, what I do research on. So for me, it's really relates to what you've just been saying, Vikas. So it's around the sort of future really interesting area in human-centered design is not just about thinking about how we can design a user interface so it works well, or an app or whatever. It's really about how do we get people to understand what is happening inside, right? So how do we make sure that any algorithms we're using, people are able to relate to, so they can really effectively use them for decision making? And I think that is something we're going to have to crack when we are using these things for making decisions about people's lives. So we're not quite there yet, but I'm optimistic that we can get there.
Thank you. I think for me, it is that equity piece. It's the scope to slow down and to bring everyone into that process, so that the technology that we're putting out into the world is equitable. Everyone has access to it and it works for everyone from the beginning, because I think the opportunity is huge to start leveling the playing field in how people access services and products that have previously not worked for them or been accessible or not available in that area. And so, yeah, that's for me what makes me excited, because I just think that there's such a huge opportunity there to really have societal impact.
Yeah. Alex, I believe you were next.
Yeah, so I'll talk about this is kind of an area that I'm personally very interested in, but the use of kind of immersive technologies and thinking about them in terms of how we can give people superpowers. And how in a future where augmented reality is kind of every day, how that might be help people solve tasks that previously they didn't think they could solve, how it might help with education for people that struggle with kind of traditional learning methods. So I think the idea of augmenting humans and their abilities for me is super interesting.
Great, thank you. Philippa.
I think for me, it's slightly different to sort of the outcomes of what can be achieved. But there is a great opportunity, I think, in how we incorporate the rights of humans and how we protect them and how we deliver all of these very exciting, excellent ways in which we can enhance being a human being through use of technologies. We do it in the safest possible way in which they have been engaged with. We're transparent about it, and they have the choice and and can generally interact with that in the way that's the most beneficial for them and for society.
Brilliant, thank you. And if I can lean on my panel for one more thing, a few of our attendees have been asking in the background about literature suggestions and where to read. So offline from this, if we could perhaps get our teams just to reach out to you, just to get some of your suggestions on places to read, and then we can circulate that with all our attendees as well. Now I'm going to come to formally thank our panel and just in just a few minutes. But before we finish, I just want to tell you all a bit more about the actual SME support and innovation program. So as part of this, eligible SMEs will be assigned a BGH innovation advisor who will support them through this entire process. It's fully funded, and it's actually going to help SMEs develop and progress their innovation opportunities. The advisors will help you develop a tailored plan of action to work with businesses, and this is all done with a £5,000 innovation voucher to help you gain access to those specialist expertise and facilities. So to register your interest for that, the email is on there, bghinnovation@growthco.co.uk. Also, next slide, George. Do make sure that if you are interested in participating, you join us for that Q&A session at 11:15, which should give us all time to get a bit of a coffee and a break, where we'll be able to raise and discuss the process in detail, raise any questions you might have. You'll be able to also find out a bit more detail about the specific innovation challenges that are coming up. But, without further ado, I just want to thank our extraordinary panel today, Caroline J, Vimla Appadu, Alex Nelson, and Philippa Nazari. It was really, really fascinating hearing from you, and I'm looking forward to watching the recording back as well and scribbling notes. It was fantastic. Thanks also to Midas, Business Growth Hub, GMCA, and the Greater Manchester LEP for their support. But a massive thank you too to the Future Everything team, and in particular, George and Chris, who've been really tying this together so well in the background. You might remember George normally hosts the beginning of the session and I just jump in at the end, but because of a few administrative things, I had to take in and fill George's excellent shoes for this. So I hope I was able to deliver a fraction of George's excellence in this. But also thank you to the amazing attendees we've had, to the brilliant questions we've had today as well. This is such a transformational program for Manchester, and actually by having all of this participation here, I'm really hoping we can start to deliver some amazing solutions from here in the north. So thanks everyone for spending your morning with us and joining us. And for those of you who are looking to participate in the innovation challenges, we'll see you back in about 15 minutes time at around 11:15. And for somebody who's asked UK time. So lovely to see everyone today. Thank you again to our panel and our keynote, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.